Hi, I'm Effie. This is What Effie Reads, and today I'm going to be talking about Hide by Kiersten White. In this video, I'm going to be talking about what I liked about this book and what I didn't like about this book. Full disclosure, this is going to be more of a negative review. I didn't actually dislike this book. I just think this was a deeply flawed novel. Also, in order for me to fully critique it, I am going to be talking in spoilers. So if you haven't read this book and don't want to be spoiled, click away now. So Hide is Kiersten White's adult debut. It is a very short novel. It's only 240 pages. I don't know if that technically means it's classed as a novella. And essentially what happens in this story is this group of 14 people are chosen to compete in a hide and seek game at an abandoned amusement park. And the last person to remain hidden after a 7-day period will win $50,000. Right off the bat, I feel like that is a really interesting story. I'm not sure how novel it is, but it is quite an intriguing plot, and it feels like it's going to be a thriller where people keep getting murdered off. And to be fair to the book, people do keep getting murdered off. Although the way it's done could have been executed a little bit better. So, as I said, this book had a lot of promise, and I think part of my issue with it is that it felt very first draft or even zero draft. There was a lot of moments in the book that I feel like just needed some tweaking to make them stronger. I also thought there was some problematic content. Now, I'm not for a moment out here trying to cancel this author. I'm not saying that the words that she uses in this book reflect the way that she feels. There were just multiple incidents of things that didn't quite sit right with me. I'm going to start by talking about the more surface level subjective issues I had with this book. So the antagonist in this book is a paranormal demonic creature. It's never named and you don't really know much about it. It's slightly drawn on the mythos of the Minotaur, but it's a little bit different. And then it gets deeper because really the antagonists are the 7 founding families, but this is the creature that is killing off the people who are playing the hide and seek game. The first time that we're introduced to this supernatural creature is when 2 of the characters are facing it down, but the way that it's written is such that the character doesn't see what this creature is. It just sees this person losing body parts as the creature disappeared. And when this was introduced, I thought it was really interesting and really cool that the monster was invisible. And I loved that. Later on in the book, it is established that this creature is not actually invisible, but can only be seen by descendants of the 7 founding families, which felt like a shame to me. It felt like a missed opportunity. I'm not sure how they could have rewritten that plot so that it could still be invisible. But I just really liked that it was invisible originally. And then the other issue I had with it was that you're made to believe for a little while that the creature is in fact invisible because the other people that see this creature aren't able to describe it. But it's written in such a way that it comes across like The reason they aren't able to describe it is because they can't actually see it, which sounds fantastic. But the resolution to that is that they actually can't describe it because it's so horrific. The problem is, the point that you realise that is basically a chapter after the book has literally just described this creature to you. So it lost any kind of merit because you've literally just described the creature. Clearly it's not indescribable. Another kind of like minor quibble with the book, although I wouldn't necessarily say it was a quibble because things do inspire other things. Like the concept that there's no such thing as an original idea holds very true, and you can see inspirations coming from all sorts of places. However, there were multiple scenes in this book where I was like, this feels like it's literally just been ripped out of Battle Royale. Now, I absolutely love Battle Royale, but part of that is because it is expertly written. You are following, I think it's 42 school children in Battle Royale, but it never feels like it's too many people. Yet in this book, you're following 14 contestants. You also have like the founding families and some other stuff going on. But primarily you're following these 14 contestants. And somehow it manages to write it in such a way that it's way too many characters. And the way that it throws all of the characters at you, there's one scene that's very reminiscent of the beginning of Battle Royale. All of these characters are on a bus and they are all unconscious because they've been drugged to be unconscious by the people running the game, which is true in both Battle Royale and Hide. The method that they are drugged is slightly different, but the fact they're both on a coach, both like falling asleep, that weird kind of situation. And during that scene, the book decides to give you a paragraph on, I think it's something like 7 of the characters, giving you their backstory, which is a lot of information to try and take in all at once. And then that was further aggravated by the fact that just a few pages later, you have a scene in a diner where the characters are all getting to know each other and they introduce themselves. So you've literally introduced all of the characters to the reader and then you reintroduce them just a few pages later. So it was a lot of info dump, a lot of information thrown at the reader, and it was so hard to keep track of which characters had which backstory. And because you had so many characters, you ended up just not caring about them. I guess further to that point is the fact that the characters do not feel fully realised. Despite all of the characters supposedly being adults, I think they're all meant to be in their 20s. They all read very young. It feels so YA, and I genuinely struggle to figure out why this book is adult beyond the fact that the protagonists are adults. I mean, don't get me wrong, I really struggle with age categorizations. And if you put a book in front of me and told me I had to tell you what age category it fell into, I wouldn't be able to tell you. So maybe it's the level of horror, the level of peril in this book. But if it is purely because the characters have been written as adults, that seems like a very strange choice. And I don't know, like there's nothing inherently wrong with the characters or the book being YA. I think the problem was that they weren't believably adults, and there was kind of this point hammered home that they were meant to be adults. And I think that for a lot of the characters, the fact that they were adults didn't really make a massive difference. Like one of the characters was an army veteran, and I don't know what the laws are in the US, but I think in the UK you can join the army at 16. Again, I could be wrong. Army's not my cup of tea. But basically you could have a character who is an army vet and they could still be a teen. You had one character who is an intern. Again, that's a character that could have been a teen. Mac, I mean, when you're first introduced to Mac, her situation feels like a foster home. And like it's almost like they've tweaked it just slightly to make her an adult. So instead of a foster home, it's a shelter, and just lots of really like weird bits where it's like, just make it YA. Like, I'm not sure what the purpose of making this book adult was, because it doesn't read very adult. But again, I'm not sure if there are elements of it that push it into the adult category. I don't know. I've got a couple more points to make of the kind of lesser issues I had with the book, and then we'll get into the more problematic issues that I had with this book. So the first of them was the fact that this book is written in what I believe is omniscient third person. So you are getting the POVs of every character, but it's all told in third person and you're kind of jumping around from person to person. And I mean, whatever, I think this would have worked better in first person or in very clear point of views. So rather than having a whole chapter where you're jumping from paragraph to paragraph and having this omniscience, you actually have like, this is a chapter from Mac's point of view, this is a chapter from Linda's point of view. I think that would have made the book constructed better. I think it also would have helped foster a sense of connection between the reader and the characters. But a larger issue with that choice of POV is that within this book, we have these journals that were basically written by the founding families, and they detail exactly what's going on in this park. They talk about how they need 14 sacrifices every 7 years, and they go into excruciating detail. And their whole role in the book is exposition. But the problem is that because this book is written in omniscient third person, you don't need the journals. You could literally have flashback scenes where you see these things happening. Or if it had been written in first person, you could have the characters reading these journals and snippets of the journals interspersed with the character's reaction. But instead you have pages and pages and pages of the journal entries and then a half a page conversation about it. And it just read very clumsily. Final, more subjective issue that I had with this book was the ending. I am the kind of person that generally doesn't mind an open ending. I think it takes a certain level of skill to pull off a good open ending. And this book just didn't have that skill. It almost felt like the author had written herself into a corner and went, oh, I don't know how to resolve this in a believable way, which is very strange because you're already suspending your disbelief. Like, this is a book that has a monster that's eating people and only the people it eats can see it. Like, it's already a massive suspension of disbelief. So you could literally write any ending. But it pretty much just ends without a resolution of what's actually going to happen for all of our characters next, what's going to become of the monster, that kind of thing. I'm not sure if it's written in such a way to leave the door open for a sequel, Although from what I've seen, I think this book's been really poorly received. So if there was intended to be a sequel, I don't think that's going to happen. But what I think would have made for a really satisfying conclusion to this book is if we'd had a 7 years later. And then that way we could see what happens next for Mac, Legrand, and Ava. We could also see what happens with the founding family. I think it would be very interesting and in some ways still an open ending, but would wrap things up in a more satisfying way. If we had an epilogue from 7 years later, and in that epilogue, we find out that the founding families have found a way of perpetuating the sacrifices, and actually the cycle of death is just going to continue. I think that would have been an interesting ending, but instead what we got was Legrand, Ava, and Mac blowing the gate off the amazement park, and then that being it. Like, we don't know what's going to happen with the monster. We know the monster needs 4 more sacrifices, or possibly 3 if it's eaten Linda. We know it needs more sacrifices. We know it's no longer trapped within the amusement park, but we just don't know what's going to happen. We also don't know what's going to happen with Mac and Ava. Like, they've known each other for 6 days, I think, at the end of the book. And, like, they fell so insta-lovey with each other. And, like, Mac had her first kiss, like, 2 days ago. And it feels like they're already planning a future. So I think it'd be interesting to see what happens with all of their stories. But I also don't want a sequel. I think this is a book that just needed an extra, like, 20 pages on the end to wrap up all of the storylines. I've just realised I've got one more subjective point before I get into the juicier things. I really didn't like the fake out deaths, or at least I didn't like the way that they were executed. So pretty early on, it was established that what would happen is that you would get a character's backstory, and then their paragraph would end with basically them being in peril and, like, them being hunted or whatever, and then that would be the end of the character. Like, you knew that was the character dying and that was the character death being signaled there. Fantastic, great, we get that. And then they did a couple of fake out deaths, and that's satisfying the first couple of times you do it because you're not expecting these characters to survive this. So it's very interesting when you get to see the characters again. Unfortunately, what that did was, because you had these couple of fake out deaths already, you then establish a pattern whereby if you don't see a body or, like, reasonable evidence of a character's death, their death hasn't happened. So when you had Ava, this character that is central to the book and you're kind of rooting for, when you had her fake out death, you don't believe it because it's already been established that you do have fake out deaths. So it took any kind of sadness from her potential death away. It took any sense of suspense, and it just made it land quite flat. So what could have been quite an impactful moment, what could have had some shock value, was taken away by the fact that you'd already used that narrative device and established a pattern where you can't believe it until you see the body, which I think is a shame because I think it could have been a really fun moment to find out that this character wasn't actually dead. But unfortunately, you're already expecting it. And now we get into my juicier issues with the book. These primarily revolve around homophobia, racism, and ableism, and just a splash of fatphobia because why not? So I'll start with the fatphobia, which I don't think was as major an issue within the book. There were a few very strange moments, And it was very clear that this author didn't know how to write fat characters, because when she was describing these characters, she danced around the word fat. At one point, there was a very strange phrase that was, she admired the heft of her core. And I'm like, what does that even mean? Like, on a logical level, I do understand what those words mean, and I understand what they're trying to convey. But just saying something about her fuller figure or her curves, not the heft of her core. And if you're not trying to say that she admired that she was a larger woman, if you're trying to say that someone looks strong or muscular, say that, because heft of the core is just a very strange way of phrasing it. The homophobia and also lesbophobia throughout the book was more of an indication of these very unlikable characters. And I guess it's more of it made me feel quite uncomfortable reading it than any like direct issue with the book. Do I think it could have pared down the homophobia and still got the point across? 100%. Do I think that these views being expressed in the book reflect the author's opinion? Probably not. But they did make for very uncomfortable reading, and to an extent it took away from the kind of burgeoning romance, because you kept having these perspectives that were from the outside that were like, ew, and it just tarnished the experience for me. The ableism is largely revolving around the way that the character of Ava, and oh my gosh, I will get onto the issue with the two Avas in a sec, but one of the characters called Ava, the one who is an army veteran, during her time in the armed forces, she sustained an injury which meant that she had a disability around one of her legs. I can't remember the specifics, but I think there was a lot of plating, she had a lot of scarring, and she also had mobility issues. And that's all great. Like, it's nice to have representation of characters that do have disabilities within the book, especially characters that are very, very strong. But my problem was that when you are introduced to Ava's disability, the way that it is described is absolutely abhorrent. Or at least the first time that I read the passage, I thought it could have been worded much better and in a much more neutral way. Because I kind of feel like the word choice puts across an image of the disability being, I don't know, I'm just going to read just a very quick passage from it. It says, Ava strips without hesitating. Her right leg is a Jackson Pollock painting of damage, abstract and misshapen with scars. I just think it's a very, very strange way of phrasing it. And I think you could introduce her disability in a way that doesn't have a kind of shade lens to it. To me, it felt very dehumanizing when Ava's disability was described in those terms. But much like if I'm talking about race or disability, like, I have mental health problems, like, I am very open with that, but I do not have physical disability, so I can't actually comment on this from an inside perspective, but it did feel like it was phrased in a very unfortunate way. And the final group of issues that I want to get onto with this book are race. So the first thing that I've alluded to slightly is you have two characters called Ava. On a very practical level, this doesn't work within the book because these two characters, especially when they are talking to one another, are just referred to as Ava, so there's no way for the reader to discern which Ava is actually talking. They don't have a clear narrative voice. So there's not even a way of being able to pick up which Ava it is from something they say or the way they act. There's no clarity there. And even the way that sometimes one of the Avas is referred to as the other Ava, which is a fair enough differentiator, except that there is at least one point in the book where it flips it and the other Ava becomes the other Ava. It's very confusing, and I know that a lot of people have struggled to figure out which Ava we're talking about, but it gets even more thorny when you look at the fact that when we're first introduced to these two Avas, they're referred to as Beautiful Ava and Buzzed Ava. And for me, calling one Ava beautiful gives an implication that the other Ava is not beautiful. And in my mind anyway, if you're going to call one of the Avas buzzed, you could call the other one blonde or curly. Like, you could refer to the other Ava's hair. Like, I mean, maybe I'm just overanalyzing this. It's highly probable that this wasn't even a deliberate move. It just made sense when it was written to the author. But it's not a long leap to go from this one's beautiful, so this one mustn't be beautiful. And that becomes even stranger when the primary relationship you see in this book is between the character of Mac and the character of Buzzed Ava. And surely it should have been the other way round, because I'm pretty sure it's implied that these are the names that Mac gives to the characters. But I think this issue gets even more thorny as later on into the book, you find out that Buzzed Ava is one of only two BIPOC characters, which is so strange and so messy, because essentially what the book says is, now I am paraphrasing here, but it's something along the lines of Ava and Rosie were the only two characters that weren't obviously white. And I was like, okay, so first off, you're calling white the default by saying that. And second off, you are potentially erasing a racial identity of anyone who might be lighter skinned or have racially ambiguous features. So that's not a great look all round. But then to further that, Rosie is one of the earlier characters to be killed off. And you also get no further information into who she is. So she essentially becomes a token BIPOC character who falls into the trope of BIPOC character who dies early, which is, again, not a great look. And the final issue I had surrounding race and privilege within this book, and I by no means think this is an exhaustive list of the problems with this book, but the final one I had was in the prologue. You are told the story of a 5-year-old girl who goes to the amusement park and ends up going missing. And then a migrant worker who was there for the day with his family, I think, is later charged with a crime. I can't remember if it's of kidnapping or murder. But then you find out that, well, I mean, you know immediately that this guy didn't do it, because, like, it would make no sense if he did do it. But it's very unambiguously expressly that this girl's disappearance was the monster taking this 5-year-old girl as a sacrifice. So essentially, you've got 7 white families in a position of massive privilege who have framed a migrant worker for a crime he didn't commit. And this is never addressed in the book. This video has ended up being significantly longer than I intended, especially because I've really only gone into the issues I had with the book. But the more I talk about it, the lower I think my overall rating is. As I was reading it, I had many moments of rolling my eyes and just groaning at the phrasing and just the way that it didn't address things properly. But I was interested, like it kept my interest. I did find the journal bits a bit tiresome, but I wanted to know what was going to happen and I wanted to know how the story was going to be resolved. But boy, did this book need multiple more drafts, some editors, possibly some sensitivity readers. And yeah, I guess that's the book. I would absolutely adore to have a conversation with you about this book. So if you have read this book, please do chat to me in the comments. Tell me if you loved it. Tell me if you hated it. Tell me if I'm overanalyzing, because I am prone to overanalyzing. If you enjoy listening to me talk about books, please do subscribe. Make sure you give this video a like. And until next time, bye.
There's a place in my heart